Prince William will go above and beyond to control the monarchy's image by stripping non-royal or non-working royals of their titles.
Recently, Prince William has been considering a shocking decision.
Have you ever wondered how a single moment involving a child could trigger a chain of events powerful enough to shake the foundations of one of the world's most famous families? According to supporters of a growing royal narrative, that is exactly what happened when an ordinary evening inside Kensington Palace allegedly turned into the beginning of a deeply troubling mystery. At first, there were no dramatic headlines, no official statements, no public confrontations. There was only a frightened child, a concerned nanny, and a mother whose instincts told her that something was terribly wrong. Yet according to many commentators, what began as a private family concern would eventually expand into a story involving loyalty, betrayal, succession, and difficult decisions about the future of Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's children. According to supporters of the narrative, the first signs of trouble appeared on what seemed like an ordinary evening inside Kensington Palace. The household was quiet, staff members were finishing their duties, and preparations for the next day's royal engagements were already underway. Nothing appeared unusual, nothing appeared threatening, and nothing suggested that a crisis was quietly developing behind palace walls. Then everything changed. According to the story, a nanny who had worked closely with Prince William and Princess Catherine's family allegedly heard unusual sounds coming from an area of the residence where no one expected to find Princess Charlotte at that hour. Concerned, she reportedly followed the noise and discovered a scene that immediately raised alarm. Charlotte, normally described as confident, composed, and remarkably mature for her age, was allegedly sitting alone in visible distress. Supporters of the narrative claim that she appeared frightened in a way that seemed completely disproportionate to the situation immediately in front of her. What reportedly unsettled the nanny most was not the tears themselves. Children cry, children become upset, and accidents happen. But according to supporters of the story, Charlotte's reaction appeared different. She seemed genuinely afraid, not embarrassed, not frustrated, but afraid. And that distinction immediately transformed an ordinary household incident into something much more concerning. According to many commentators, the nanny's instincts told her that this was not an isolated event. As she attempted to comfort the young princess, fragments of information allegedly began emerging. Small comments, brief explanations, and indications that the distress she was witnessing may have been building for some time. Supporters of the narrative claim that Charlotte appeared hesitant to speak openly, as though she feared consequences if she revealed too much. Whether those fears were justified remains impossible to verify. Nevertheless, within the narrative, this moment became the catalyst for everything that followed. According to the story, the nanny spent the remainder of the evening trying to reassure Charlotte while quietly assessing the seriousness of the situation. The more she listened, the more concerned she became. And by the following morning, she allegedly concluded that the matter could no longer remain an internal household concern. Someone needed to know. Someone needed to investigate. And that someone was Princess Catherine. According to supporters of the narrative, Catherine's reaction was immediate. While she is often portrayed publicly as calm, measured, and composed, commentators argue that a very different side emerges whenever her children are involved. The future queen may represent duty and stability in public life, but she is also a mother. And according to the story, the possibility that one of her children felt unsafe instantly transformed a routine day into a personal mission. What makes this stage of the narrative especially compelling is that Catherine allegedly resisted the temptation to jump to conclusions. She did not issue accusations. She did not create a public scandal. And she did not allow emotion to overwhelm judgment. Instead, supporters of the story claim she began asking questions. Careful questions. Quiet questions. Questions designed to uncover facts rather than assumptions. According to many royal observers, it was during these early conversations that the first truly disturbing details allegedly began emerging. Charlotte reportedly suggested that the incident was not unique. Certain encounters had allegedly occurred before. Certain interactions had left her uncomfortable. And certain explanations offered by members of the household allegedly failed to provide reassurance. Supporters of the narrative argue that these revelations immediately elevated the situation from a simple misunderstanding to a potential pattern requiring serious attention. According to the story, Catherine soon shared her concerns with Prince William. The future king reportedly approached the matter with the same seriousness. Not as a royal issue, but as a parental one. Before questions of protocol, before questions of reputation, and before questions of succession, there was a child who felt frightened, and that alone demanded answers. Supporters of the narrative claim that William and Catherine quickly agreed on one critical principle: the investigation would remain private until facts could be established. No leaks, no speculation, and no unnecessary publicity. If something was genuinely wrong, they intended to discover the truth themselves before anyone else became involved. According to many commentators, that decision would ultimately prove crucial because the deeper they looked, the more unusual the situation allegedly became. What neither William nor Catherine allegedly realized at the time was that this would be only the beginning. Because according to supporters of the narrative, the questions surrounding Charlotte's distress would soon lead investigators toward unexplained behavior, suspicious activities inside the palace, and a sequence of discoveries that seemed to stretch far beyond a single household incident. And as more pieces of the puzzle emerged, the story would reportedly evolve from a family concern into a crisis with implications reaching all the way across the Atlantic, raising difficult questions about trust, loyalty, and the future place of Harry and Meghan's children within the royal family itself. According to supporters of the narrative, the atmosphere inside Kensington Palace allegedly became increasingly tense as Catherine's private investigation moved forward, because what had initially appeared to be an isolated emotional incident involving Princess Charlotte was now beginning to resemble something far more serious. And with every new conversation, every observation from trusted staff members, and every additional detail emerging from Charlotte herself, the future Princess of Wales reportedly became more convinced that her daughter's distress could not simply be explained away as childhood anxiety or an unfortunate misunderstanding. According to the story, Catherine's first priority was not identifying a suspect but understanding exactly what Charlotte had been experiencing, because before any conclusions could be reached, she needed to determine whether there was a genuine pattern behind the disturbing behavior that had allegedly been occurring for weeks. And supporters of the narrative claim that it was during a series of private conversations between mother and daughter that the first truly alarming revelations began to surface, as Charlotte reportedly described incidents that extended far beyond the single evening witnessed by her nanny, and suggested that certain interactions inside the palace had left her feeling frightened long before anyone realized the extent of the problem. What reportedly unsettled Catherine most was not merely what Charlotte said. It was how she said it. The hesitation, the uncertainty, the fear of getting someone into trouble, and the apparent belief that remaining silent might somehow make the problem disappear. According to supporters of the narrative, Charlotte allegedly described occasions when a member of the household staff entered her room late in the evening under seemingly harmless pretenses, offering explanations that sounded perfectly reasonable on the surface, yet left the young princess feeling increasingly uncomfortable, confused, and anxious afterward. And while none of the incidents individually appeared dramatic enough to trigger an immediate crisis, together they allegedly formed a pattern that Catherine could no longer ignore. According to many commentators, it was at this point that Prince William became directly involved in the investigation, because while Catherine had initially approached the matter as a mother's concern, the growing number of unanswered questions reportedly convinced both parents that a more systematic examination was necessary, and supporters of the narrative claim that William immediately agreed that discretion was essential, not only to protect Charlotte's privacy, but also to avoid falsely accusing anyone before sufficient evidence had been gathered. According to the story, attention soon focused on a particular staff member whose name repeatedly surfaced during conversations with Charlotte and other household personnel, not because there was definitive proof of wrongdoing, but because the circumstances surrounding the individual allegedly appeared increasingly unusual the more closely they were examined. And supporters of the narrative argue that several seemingly minor inconsistencies began raising concerns among those conducting the inquiry, including discrepancies involving work schedules, unexplained visits to certain areas of the residence, and behavior that some observers reportedly described as nervous or evasive whenever questions were asked. What made the situation especially complicated was the absence of clear evidence. There were no public confrontations, no visible injuries, and no obvious explanation that immediately connected all the pieces. Instead, there were only suspicions, fragments of testimony, and a growing sense among William and Catherine that something important remained hidden beneath the surface. According to supporters of the narrative, this uncertainty actually increased their determination because every attempt to obtain straightforward answers allegedly produced new questions rather than clarity. According to many royal observers, one of the most significant moments reportedly occurred when Catherine decided to spend additional private time alone with Charlotte, creating an environment where the young princess felt safe enough to discuss details she had previously avoided sharing. And it was during these conversations that Charlotte allegedly revealed fears extending beyond ordinary childhood concerns, describing comments and encounters that appeared specifically designed to undermine her confidence, increase her anxiety, and make her question her place within her own family environment. Supporters of the narrative claim that hearing these accounts transformed Catherine's concern into conviction, because the pattern described by her daughter no longer resembled accidental misunderstandings, but instead suggested intentional psychological pressure. According to the story, William and Catherine subsequently agreed that the investigation needed to expand beyond simple interviews and observations, leading them to quietly examine additional information that might either confirm or eliminate their growing suspicions. And supporters of the narrative argue that this decision marked a major turning point because it shifted the inquiry from personal testimony toward objective evidence, creating the possibility that facts rather than assumptions would ultimately determine what had really been happening behind palace walls. What makes this stage of the narrative particularly intriguing is that several developments allegedly began occurring simultaneously. Questions emerged about unusual communications, questions emerged about unexplained behavior, and questions emerged about whether the individual at the center of the inquiry might have been acting independently or responding to influences originating elsewhere. At first, these possibilities appeared speculative, perhaps even unlikely. Yet according to supporters of the narrative, each new discovery gradually expanded the scope of the investigation beyond what anyone initially imagined. According to many commentators, the most troubling aspect was that the evidence reportedly pointed toward planning rather than spontaneity, because certain actions appeared too consistent, too deliberate, and too carefully timed to be dismissed as random behavior, and supporters of the narrative claim that William and Catherine increasingly found themselves confronting a disturbing possibility, that Charlotte's distress may have been the result of a sustained effort rather than a series of isolated incidents. If true, that realization would dramatically alter the seriousness of the situation and raise questions extending far beyond a single member of palace staff. According to the story, however, the breakthrough that would change everything had not yet arrived. Because just as William and Catherine were struggling to separate suspicion from proof, new information allegedly emerged involving missing recordings, unexplained digital activity, and evidence suggesting that someone had been working very hard to ensure that certain events remained hidden. And according to supporters of the narrative, those discoveries would soon lead the investigation in an entirely unexpected direction, one that allegedly stretched far beyond Kensington Palace and raised questions no one had anticipated when Charlotte was first found crying on that ordinary evening weeks earlier. According to supporters of the narrative, the investigation allegedly entered an entirely new phase when Catherine began realizing that the answers she needed might not be found through interviews alone, because although Charlotte's descriptions were becoming more detailed and the behavior of certain staff members reportedly appeared increasingly suspicious, there was still one major problem standing in the way of certainty. There was no definitive proof explaining what had actually been happening behind closed doors during the late-night encounters that seemed to be causing the young princess such distress. And according to many commentators, it was precisely at this point that a series of unexpected discoveries reportedly transformed a troubling family concern into a far larger mystery. According to the story, one of the first major breakthroughs allegedly came during another private conversation between Catherine and Charlotte, when the young princess reportedly revealed something she had not mentioned previously because she did not fully understand its significance at the time, explaining that she had once attempted to record some of the unusual nighttime encounters using an older mobile phone that she occasionally kept in her room, believing that if she could capture evidence, then adults would finally understand why she felt so frightened. Supporters of the narrative claim that Charlotte's statement immediately captured Catherine's attention because it suggested there might once have been objective evidence supporting the child's concerns. What happened next allegedly raised even more questions. The recordings were gone. Not hidden, not misplaced. Gone. According to supporters of the narrative, Charlotte reportedly explained that when she later attempted to access the files, every recording had somehow disappeared from the device, leaving her confused and discouraged because she believed the evidence she had worked so hard to preserve had simply vanished without explanation. For Catherine, however, the disappearance allegedly suggested something far more troubling. According to many royal observers, the missing recordings reportedly altered the entire direction of the investigation because the possibility that evidence had been deliberately removed introduced an entirely new element into the story, one involving planning, concealment, and technical knowledge rather than isolated incidents or misunderstandings. Supporters of the narrative argue that this was the moment when Catherine allegedly became convinced that whoever was responsible understood exactly what they were doing and was actively attempting to avoid detection. According to the story, another crucial development soon followed. Months earlier, Catherine had reportedly made a precautionary decision that seemed completely unimportant at the time. Like many protective parents, and particularly given the security responsibilities surrounding royal children, she had allegedly approved additional monitoring measures designed to provide reassurance whenever she and William were traveling or engaged in official duties. Supporters of the narrative claim that one of those measures would unexpectedly become the most important source of evidence in the entire investigation. According to supporters of the story, Catherine reportedly remembered that a discrete recording device had been positioned in a location capable of capturing activity within Charlotte's room under specific circumstances, and although it had never been intended for investigative purposes, the existence of the footage allegedly offered a rare opportunity to verify whether the concerns being raised by Charlotte matched what had actually been occurring. According to many commentators, William and Catherine reviewed the recordings together, hoping either to confirm their fears or finally eliminate them. What they allegedly discovered shocked them, not because of dramatic scenes, not because of physical confrontations, but because of consistency, timing, and repetition. According to supporters of the narrative, the footage reportedly showed repeated visits occurring during late-night hours when Charlotte should have been asleep, with behavior that investigators allegedly considered difficult to explain through ordinary household responsibilities alone. Supporters of the story claim that the recordings appear to support Charlotte's description of recurring encounters and raised fresh questions about why those visits were taking place so frequently. According to many royal observers, the significance of the footage extended beyond the events themselves because it reportedly demonstrated that the situation was not limited to a single misunderstanding or isolated incident. Instead, the evidence allegedly pointed toward a sustained pattern unfolding over an extended period of time, thereby strengthening concerns that Charlotte's emotional distress had identifiable causes rather than purely subjective fears. According to the narrative, another suspicious development emerged almost immediately afterward when the staff member at the center of the inquiry allegedly submitted an unexpected resignation request, citing personal reasons and expressing a desire to leave palace employment as quickly as possible, a decision that supporters of the story interpreted as highly unusual given the timing and the growing scrutiny already surrounding the investigation. While resignations occur for many legitimate reasons, commentators within the narrative argue that the request reportedly intensified suspicions because it arrived precisely when questions were beginning to mount. What makes this stage of the story especially dramatic is that investigators allegedly expanded their review beyond personal interactions and household schedules. They reportedly began examining communications, financial information, and patterns of contact that might reveal whether anyone outside the palace had knowledge of the events under investigation. At first, nothing appeared conclusive, but according to supporters of the narrative, unusual details slowly began emerging. Details involving transactions, connections, and activity that allegedly could not be easily explained through ordinary circumstances. According to many commentators, this was the moment when the investigation reportedly stopped being solely about palace staff and started raising questions that extended far beyond Kensington Palace itself. The possibility that outside influences might somehow be connected to the unfolding events allegedly transformed the inquiry into something much larger, forcing William and Catherine to consider explanations they had never initially imagined. Supporters of the narrative argue that each new discovery seemed to point toward a deeper level of coordination, suggesting that the situation might involve more than one individual acting alone. According to the story, by the time investigators assembled the growing collection of footage, missing recordings, behavioral patterns, resignation attempts, and financial irregularities, William and Catherine allegedly understood that they were approaching a decisive moment. The evidence was no longer leading toward simple answers. Instead, it was pointing toward a possibility so serious that even considering it felt almost unimaginable. And according to supporters of the narrative, the breakthrough that followed would allegedly expose connections reaching beyond palace walls, triggering confrontations that threatened to deepen one of the most painful divisions the royal family had faced in years. According to supporters of the narrative, the investigation allegedly reached a turning point when the growing collection of evidence began producing a picture that was impossible for William and Catherine to ignore, because what had started as a troubling concern about Princess Charlotte's emotional well-being was now evolving into something far more serious, involving hidden activity, unexplained financial movements, and behavior that appeared increasingly difficult to explain through innocent misunderstandings. And according to many royal commentators, it was during this stage that the inquiry reportedly shifted from gathering information to preparing for confrontation. According to the story, the staff member at the center of the investigation allegedly became increasingly nervous as scrutiny intensified. Questions were being asked, movements were being monitored, and opportunities to operate unnoticed were rapidly disappearing. Supporters of the narrative claim that the sudden resignation request, which had initially seemed suspicious, now appeared even more significant because it reportedly coincided with the moment investigators began examining communications and financial records more closely. What once looked like a routine departure allegedly began to resemble an attempt to leave before the full truth emerged. According to many observers, William and Catherine reportedly remained determined to avoid acting prematurely despite mounting suspicions, because both understood that accusations without proof could create enormous damage, particularly within an institution where loyalty and trust are considered essential. Yet supporters of the narrative argue that the evidence was no longer pointing in multiple directions. Instead, it was gradually converging toward a single explanation, one suggesting that Charlotte's distress had not been accidental and that someone had allegedly been working deliberately to undermine her sense of security. What makes this stage of the narrative especially dramatic is the alleged discovery of financial irregularities. Not one transaction, not two, but a pattern, transfers, contacts, an activity that investigators reportedly considered highly unusual. According to supporters of the story, these findings raised a critical question. If money had changed hands, why? And who is ultimately behind it? According to many royal commentators, this was the moment when the investigation allegedly expanded beyond palace staff and began focusing on possible connections outside royal residences altogether. Supporters of the narrative claim that investigators discovered indications suggesting the staff member may have been communicating with individuals far removed from day-to-day palace operations, thereby introducing a possibility that few had seriously considered at the beginning of the inquiry. If true, the implications would be enormous, because the situation would no longer involve a single individual making poor decisions. It would potentially involve coordination, planning, and outside influence. According to the story, Catherine was reportedly devastated by this possibility, not because of political consequences, not because of media implications, but because every new discovery reinforced the belief that her daughter had endured weeks of fear while adults around her remained unaware of what was happening. Supporters of the narrative argue that Catherine's determination intensified dramatically during this period. The investigation was no longer simply about identifying responsibility. It was about ensuring that Charlotte would never experience the same fear again. According to many observers, William faced a different but equally painful challenge. As evidence accumulated, supporters of the narrative claim that some of the emerging possibilities allegedly pointed toward individuals connected to one of the deepest fractures within the modern royal family. For years, tensions involving Harry, Meghan, and the wider family had dominated headlines. Yet according to the story, William reportedly never imagined that an investigation involving his daughter could eventually intersect with those long-standing divisions. What makes this chapter particularly compelling is that the alleged breakthrough did not arrive through a dramatic confession. It arrived through accumulation, one clue after another, one inconsistency after another, one discovery building upon the last, until eventually investigators reportedly believed they had enough information to begin presenting their findings. According to supporters of the narrative, the atmosphere inside palace offices allegedly became increasingly serious as preparations were made for what could become one of the most consequential internal confrontations in recent royal history. According to many commentators, the central question was no longer whether wrongdoing had occurred. The question was how far the situation extended, and whether those responsible had acted independently or under the influence of others. Supporters of the narrative claim that the answer would determine not only the outcome of the investigation, but also the future relationship between members of the royal family whose ties had already been strained for years. According to the story, the decisive moment allegedly arrived when investigators assembled the evidence into a single comprehensive account, bringing together recordings, witness statements, financial information, behavioral patterns, and other findings that reportedly supported their conclusions. For William and Catherine, the results were said to be both relieving and devastating. Relieving because they finally understood what had been happening. Devastating because of where the evidence allegedly pointed. Supporters of the narrative argue that the conclusions forced William into an impossible position, balancing his responsibilities as a father determined to protect his daughter with his lingering connection to a brother whose relationship with the family had already been pushed to the breaking point. According to many royal observers, this confrontation would allegedly become the emotional center of the entire story, because once the findings were presented, there would be no avoiding difficult decisions. Questions regarding trust, accountability, financial support, and the future status of Harry and Meghan's children would suddenly move from speculation to active discussion. And according to supporters of the narrative, the choices William allegedly made afterward would permanently reshape relationships within the family while demonstrating how far he was prepared to go when the well-being of his children was at stake. According to supporters of the narrative, the final chapter of the story allegedly began the moment William realized that the investigation was no longer simply about identifying who had frightened Charlotte. It had become a test of responsibility, loyalty, and the difficult choices that come with protecting the future of the monarchy. For weeks, William and Catherine had reportedly focused on gathering facts, avoiding speculation, and ensuring that every allegation was examined carefully. But according to the narrative, once investigators believed they had assembled a complete picture of what had occurred, a far more painful question emerged. What should happen next? According to the story, William's reaction was shaped first and foremost by his role as a father. Before titles, before protocol, and before family politics, there was a child who had allegedly spent weeks living in fear. A child who no longer felt completely safe in her own room. And a child whose trust had reportedly been damaged by people she believed were there to protect her. Supporters of the narrative argue that this reality left William with little room for compromise. Whatever decisions followed, they claim, would be guided by Charlotte's well-being above all else. According to many commentators, this is where the controversy surrounding Harry and Meghan's children allegedly entered the discussion. Within the narrative, senior royal advisors reportedly began reviewing long-term arrangements connected to future financial support, ceremonial privileges, and the broader relationship between the Sussex family and the institution. Supporters of the story argue that these conversations were not presented as punishment directed toward children, but rather as part of a wider reassessment of family relationships after trust had allegedly been damaged. Whether such discussions ever occurred remains unverified. However, within the narrative, they became the symbolic consequence of the crisis. What makes this stage particularly emotional is William's alleged internal conflict. According to supporters of the story, he was not confronting a stranger. He was confronting the possibility of a permanent fracture with his own brother. Years earlier, few people could have imagined such a situation. The two princes had shared childhood experiences unlike anyone else in the world. They had endured public scrutiny together. They had mourned their mother together, and they had once appeared inseparable. According to the narrative, that history made the situation especially painful because every decision carried consequences extending far beyond the immediate investigation. According to many royal observers, Catherine remained focused on a different priority throughout the process. While questions about royal relationships dominated public speculation, supporters of the narrative claim that Catherine concentrated on helping Charlotte recover emotionally. The alleged investigation may have uncovered answers, but answers alone could not erase fear. According to the story, Catherine spent significant time reassuring her daughter, rebuilding her confidence, and ensuring that she understood she had done nothing wrong by speaking up. Supporters of the narrative argue that this became one of the most important lessons of the entire episode. What makes the ending especially powerful is that Charlotte allegedly emerged stronger from the experience. The fear gradually faded, the uncertainty gradually disappeared, and the sense of security that had been shaken slowly returned. According to supporters of the story, seeing that recovery reinforced William and Catherine's belief that they had made the correct decisions, regardless of how difficult those decisions may have been. For them, protecting their children came first. Everything else came second. According to many commentators, the broader significance of the narrative lies in its portrayal of duty. The story presents William as a future king forced to place responsibility above personal emotion, even when doing so involves people he once loved and trusted. Supporters of the narrative argue that this theme resonates because it reflects one of the oldest challenges in royal history, the tension between family loyalty and institutional responsibility. When those two obligations collide, difficult choices become unavoidable. According to the narrative, the ultimate lesson is not about scandal. It is not about revenge. And it is not about palace intrigue. It is about trust. Once trust is broken, rebuilding it becomes extraordinarily difficult, whether between parents and staff, between brothers, or between members of one of the world's most famous families. Supporters of the story argue that this is why the alleged events continue attracting attention. At its heart, the narrative revolves around universal themes that people everywhere understand: protecting children, defending family, and making difficult decisions when those you care about appear connected to painful circumstances. As the story concludes, supporters of the narrative claim that William's priority remained unchanged from the very beginning. Not titles, not headlines, and not public opinion. His focus was allegedly the safety and happiness of his family. And according to many commentators, that commitment ultimately defined every decision that followed, shaping the outcome of the crisis and reinforcing the image of a future king determined to place duty above everything else. So what do you think? If you were in William's position, would protecting your child come before preserving family relationships? Or should every effort be made to keep the family united regardless of the circumstances? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed today's video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our latest coverage of Prince William, Catherine, Princess of Wales, Prince Harry, Duke of Sussex, and the ongoing story surrounding the British royal family. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video.